Welcome to Community Radio, for and by Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities, designed to share our stories and experiences as we navigate the world. Operating on the land of many traditional territories, Community Radio is recorded on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. Our participants' stories and opinions are that of their own and represent as such. Welcome to Community Radio, Episode 2. What is rest? What is restoration? And why are these concepts different for Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities? These are questions Tulsi seeks to answer. Passionate about making rest accessible, Tulsi teaches us how to better connect with our bodies through the 7 kinds of rest. In this episode, learn about care beyond a nightly face mask. Presenting this week's guest, Tulsi, with Face Masks Are Not a Cure-All, Dissecting Rest and Restoration in Marginalized Communities.
Awesome. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in again and welcome back to Community Radio. As always, I'm your host, Amira, the Community Learning Coordinator. And this week we have an awesome guest with us. Just to start, can you please state your name and your pronouns?
Absolutely. My name is Tulsi Pandya and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. So Tulsi's got a lot to talk to us about today. So leading into our first question, what was your experience growing up with a disability and being part of a racial minority? And how did those identities intersect for you?
So in my case, I didn't quite grow up with it. The chronic pain for me started when I was about 16. And this is a bit of a touchy age where you're already going through puberty and a number of changes, and just add another layer of just constant pain on top of all of this. So it's really at a time where you're not good at advocating for yourself, especially being of an Indian background, where oftentimes um, you're sort of grown to take more of a subordinate role. So advocating for yourself and growing out of the role of just being subordinate or just dismissive towards your own needs is very difficult. And then from there, it's just an understanding of being from an Indian background, natural remedies, a lot less medicalization of your health was very key and difficult thing to navigate because towards the end, when, I did end up getting diagnosis and going through the process, unfortunately, it did require a lot of heavy medication, which was very much so clashing with not only my personal values, which have changed, through the dynamic of being ill, but also clashing when you are a minor and under the care of your parents. So there is a lot of their influence as well. So um, one of the things that also I think was really important to look at as a racial minority, which I think Faria Roshin in her book really does a phenomenal job of explaining, is that um, are we indiscriminate with other people's feelings because we're so callous with ours? And growing up, this is very much so immigrant tautology, where basically you are as flexible as possible. If you're upset about something, you don't necessarily have the right to feel that way because you're always trying not to rock the boat. Always trying to very much so placate everyone, make sure everyone's feeling fine at the expense of your own needs or wants. And one of the things that really stood out that she also mentioned is that um, becoming impenetrable as praxis and working harder for as praxis. So praxis, to simplify the term, is really just sort of an accepted practice or custom. And working harder is always the mentality that I was raised with. But it's very difficult because when you are ill, you realize that you are not invincible. You have limits. And even not being ill, right? You do have limits, but you might not have certain things such as pain or a day where like you really cannot keep yourself going, become more of a barrier to yourself. And I think Edward Matei says it really well in one of his books, When the Body Says No, where he basically says, um, when we've been prevented from learning how to say no, which is oftentimes the case as a racial minority, saying no and having sort of those key boundaries doesn't exist, well, our bodies may end up saying it for us. And this flexibility and this lack of boundaries is really, unfortunately, a very big part of being a racial minority, where you have to be flexible, and any form of inflexibility is seen as sort of stubbornness, insubordination, or even just like you're not, you're hard to work with,
Yeah.
when, the counterparts are able to put those boundaries in very simply. And it's really frustrating because um, this is oftentimes where you're pushing yourself to outperform beyond your body's means,
Mm.
and especially in an environment that doesn't necessarily permit rest. I have a
Yeah.
few other points.
No,
So
please.
there's also just the way in which laziness and disability is seen, because
Mm.
um, in a time where you're in pain, by all means rest. But if that becomes a little too frequent, then it becomes more of a place of doubt of, oh, are you actually in pain, or is this an excuse? So this sort of constant battle between, are you being lazy, or are you using your disability to sort of be lazy, when in reality it's not. It's just your body needs rest, and that's what it needs
Mm.
today, and being okay with the fact that it needs that rest. And I know that growing up in being a racial minority, because a lot of our work ethic is very much so always working, it's not conducive
Mm-hmm.
to allowing yourself to rest. You may be physically resting, but mentally, there's always something running or churning at the back of your mind that's not actually going to let you fully rest. And then I guess the biggest thing is hard work above all else. And I think Freya Roshin also mentioned really well that listening to your body's need is a very radical practice, because for a culture that values hard work and success at such a high esteem, it's very hard to sort of separate two things that are so inextricably part of the identity of being part of a racial minority group. So that has been sort of my experience with disability and just being part of a racial minority group.
No, thank you for sharing. And I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that idea of especially working hard past your body, if the immigrant experience or the first gen experience of your parents working hard to come here. And so I think that that'll resonate a lot with people listening. Um, let's segue into, we kind of touched on a few things, but tell us about your story and how we got here and becoming passionate about rest.
For sure. Um, so my pain started about 16. It started as, very episodic, like, bothered me for an hour, went away. So I'm not thinking much
Mm.
of it. Okay, I probably ate something wrong, or like ate something that didn't quite sit with me. That's all right. I did end up seeking out medical help after about, I think,
Mm.
6 months, because that's when I realized, okay, well, it's been 6 months and it's not going away. So clearly something is not right here. But again, at this time, being 16 means that you're young, you're not used to advocating for yourself, and you're not used to having to speak out even when someone of authority, which in this case was my family doctor, is dismissing your concerns, or
Mhm.
just slapping medication saying, this is your solution. And in my case, that wasn't my solution, because you're not giving me a diagnosis or something
Mm.
tangible to work with. I'm very much so of the aspect that medicine's great, but I think lifestyle changes to support your medication
Mm.
or other things should be sort of a combination to whatever your treatment plan is. Eventually, I began pursuing post-secondary education, really without much of an answer, and that's when a lot more trouble started to arise, because there is more of a demand when it comes to your studies. Um, and then you also want to make sure that you're not attending lectures that you're, so paying so much money for. So my attendance, I wanted to make sure was a variable, but I still needed time to rest. And especially on days where I was having pain episodes, it's not possible. So being from an
Mm.
Indian family, there's sort of extra care from parents that you get, which is very comforting to know that they care, but it can also be overwhelming. And oftentimes I found myself sort of censoring or downplaying what my experiences were, because living 5 hours away from
Mm.
home is not helpful for them.
Yeah.
They feel helpless in not being able to help me, but having made the active decision to live 5 hours away, I knew what I was signing up for. So time went
Mm.
on. Unfortunately, I have made many trips to the ER, because despite getting second opinions from a new family doctor, I really wasn't getting any answers, and that was frustrating,
Mm.
because what had started out as, an hour a day had now started into just 4 days of constant pain, not being able to eat, sleep, or, drink even water. So when you have prolonged periods where it's not only putting you behind in school, but you might not even be able to go to work, which was the case for me as well, it was becoming more and more impairing to the things that I wanted to do with my life. So eventually, I had to go to the ER in a bit of an emergency situation, and things and on the medical side actually came out very abnormal. So they progressed a
Mm.
little bit more, and my absolute heartfelt gratitude to this doctor, who I'm going out on a limb and saying that there was some sort of different ability here because I was asked to remove my face mask and wear a face shield so she was able to read my lips. But she was the first doctor to really take my concerns seriously. Um, and I think that's because she had the basic empathy and understanding that this person who's come into the ER several times is not here because the ER is a fun place to be, rather because this is their last ditch attempt at finding something.
Mm.
So lo and behold, about 8 months after getting my diagnosis from that doctor, I ended up having to get emergency surgery,
Mm.
which is not a great experience, would not recommend. um, and then I was admitted out of the hospital, had to be readmitted due to complications. And then I left the hospital eventually. And after a week or two, I was walking and talking as normally as I would have been. So
Mm.
it's been an interesting journey. It's been about a year now that I've had surgery and living life as normally as you possibly can. But there's still effects, mental and physical, from having had that pain. And lacking an organ also does not help either.
Yep.
So it's been a time, but through it all, I've definitely learned the value of rest. I can't say I'm 100% perfect at it,
Mm.
but there's still more of an active effort to make more space for rest and be okay with needing it.
Absolutely. And I'm so sorry for your experience. I think the intersection of race, of having disability, of gender really comes into play. And I'm sure we can list tons of stats of just doctors not listening to women and not listening to pain. So I'm really happy that
Sure.
there was a doctor who listened, but obviously, you know, very common experience. So you've taken us through your journey of now we're trying to understand rest. So what is rest and why is it important to define it?
For sure. So rest, I think a lot of the times is seen as something as sleep or lying down and scrolling on your phone or watching a TV show. And don't get me wrong, they are methods of rest, but rest really is not just replenishing yourself physically, emotionally, or mentally, but it's also a fine balancing act between seeking out meaningful engagement in the activities that you partake in, whether that's working out, going to work, volunteering, being a student, whatever that means to be meaningfully engaged in various activities, and also finding sort of periods of rest or downtime where you nourish yourself. So, unfortunately, our representation of rest is very much so rooted in capitalism, and it drives me nuts because there's actually a term for it. It's called the wellness industrial complex, where we've basically been sold this idea that, you know, paying for a face mask or going on a
Mm.
spa day is going to magically give you rest. It might. I'm not going to say it's not, but this is not the end all be all representation of rest. A face mask is not going to solve your problems, much less is
Mm.
not the only form of self care. While I do want to mention that this commodification of rest is good
Mhm.
in a way that we're more aware of what it is, but it's not going to fix everything. Yes, a face mask I think is a good alternative to maybe going to a spa, which is not necessarily monetarily accessible to everyone. Um, but and I'm going to give credit where it's due,
Mhm.
because it's going to encourage living within our means, but that doesn't take
Mm.
away from the continuous marketing of what rest is supposed to be. And I'd say rest as someone who might be disabled is much more demanding because quick fixes like a face mask don't contribute to, you know, the multifaceted exhaustion that comes with being disabled, from the physical exhaustion of just being in pain, from the mental
Mm.
exhaustion of just, okay, I've been out of it for 4 days. Now I have to play this constant game of catch up. So
Mm.
um, it really is so multifaceted and so different for each person that really it takes time and some reflection to understand what it means to you. So there are 7 types of rest, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. But just something to sort of keep in your mind that rest can be physical, mental, sensory, it can be creative, emotional, social, or spiritual. And each one has so many different activities that you can engage in to find what rest is for you and what works for you. Because again, not everyone has the same opportunities or privilege to access certain things, but whatever works for you within your means
Mm.
um, is the best way that you can get rest instead of sort of stretching yourself.
Absolutely. And thank you for defining or explaining, the 7 types of rest. I know we'll talk about that a little later. I just wanted to go back to one thing you said of the wellness industrial complex. Perhaps for people who have
Mm-hmm.
never heard that term before, what is that and why is it maybe not super helpful. I didn't want to say bad, but
No,
yeah.
it's not bad. I think one thing that I will give credit to, which I did, is it's made it more accessible is not the word, affordable is the correct word. If I wanted to, just spend a nice day, and I can grab a face mask. I'm not going to say no, I do enjoy them. But the problem with the wellness industrial complex is it's taken self-care and rest and commodified it through capitalism. So you get this very weird mishmash. Um, so a lot of practices that were once very so for example, one of the things that I can think of off the top of my head is mindfulness.
Mm,
Mindfulness is a great start, but for Hiroshi mentioned that mindfulness very much so is a stripped down version of what meditation is. So
mm,
it's all surface, none of the substance. And then there's also no acknowledgement of where the practice originates from, which is the case for a lot of things within, the wellness community, for example, gua shas and just where they originate from. There's a number of practices. And I think it's great that people are um, exploring them, but it's also good to acknowledge that a lot of these practices were originally rooted and originate from very marginalized communities. So they've been
mhm,
stolen and then they're sold back to us. A very key example, which I can think of, is, for example, puppy yoga. I think yoga is a phenomenal thing, and I think the intent behind it is great. Don't get me wrong.
mhm.
They are trying to, the purpose of maybe having more puppies out for adoption, more awareness, that's great. But then you're
Mm,
taking away from the spiritual grounding and mindfulness aspect of yoga. So you get this very bad mismatch of capitalism really misrepresenting a lot of great wellness techniques,
mm.
and co-opting them and commodifying them. And it is expensive. I forget the exact statistic, but for how Roshi mentions that meditation apps have taken off. Something that was
Yes.
otherwise supposed to be self-guided practice is now you pay for a subscription, which I think is very mind-boggling. And that's not to say that you can't find the same things on YouTube, but we've made it into a thing where, oh, if you pay for a subscription, you're doing it a little bit better. Or it's like, oh, pay for this and then you'll get it. Well, in reality, you don't need all of that. If it
Mm,
helps you to start, by all means, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But again, certain things have been made more affordable. Like I think face masks are a little bit more affordable
oh,
and they do exist in more places, but things such as meditation, it is a little bit harder to start with. So maybe
mm,
an app might help you, right? But then it's also this reliance that this is the only way that I can engage in this activity, right? So
mhm,
the wellness industrial complex is very interesting. I think it's have some good,
mm,
but again, it is as with many things with capitalism, it is profiting off of a lot of practices which a lot of like Indigenous communities and marginalized communities originally practice, and now they've sort of been brought to more of the mainstream, and unfortunately have lost a lot of the meaning that originally was part of the practice. So that's what I'd say. Like it's good, it's bad, as with most things.
absolutely. And I think it's so good that you explained listed a couple examples there. Yoga is such a big one where it's really been stripped down in terms of the Western context, with Indigenous practices like sweat lodges or other ceremonial practices. Yeah, we really, really, well, not we, but Western society has really stripped it down. So it's so important to be mindful of that. So, do you think that that is some of the reason why marginalized people have such a complicated relationship to rest, or why, in general, do you think that we have this dichotomy between our understanding of rest and what we're able to do?
100%. So again, like being first gen and being of Indian background, um, a lot of our practices that I see are not ours anymore. So it's hard to
Mm,
engage in them without someone necessarily pointing out that, oh, it's a little too spiritual, or it's a little too religious. And I was like, that's not the point. This is what this was rooted in. The way I practice is may differ from you, but that
mm,
doesn't mean that it's any less effective or engaging for you and I. The other thing is also just how working hard and how working hard will give you access to the same opportunities is very much so an
mm,
immigrant tautology. So Sylvia Bonino in Coping with Chronic Illness sort of mentions that economic autonomy is indispensable for self-realization. So in the case
mm,
of me, I am first gen, so economic autonomy is very important to me, being able to find a job, being able to support myself, maybe even being able to support my parents. And my parents' their ideology was surviving. Mine is
Mm,
self-realization. So there's this clash of
mm,
ideology, which is really, really hard, as well as just sort of seeing practices that were once are taken away, right? The way in which I
mm,
practice yoga is 100% different from the way my mom does it. So
mm,
again, you just have this constant battle, not only with ourselves and as a marginalized community, with non-marginalized communities, but within the community as well. You have this
mm,
constant clashing, which is frustrating because you have to overcome sort of the internal conflict before you try to battle something way beyond your community. Um, and the other thing is like, one thing to know is that when you have limitations on work, it requires such a profound restructuring of one's identity, self-image, sense of existence, and relationship with others, which I think Bonino explains phenomenally because that's something I've experienced where I do clash with my parents more often than
mm,
not because when I'm not doing anything, there's a sense of, well, you could be doing so much more with your time, but that time for me
mm,
is allotted to rest. So just sort of that internal conflict. The other thing also is just advocacy because I have to
mm.
advocate every moment that I am resting and not
Yeah.
trying to do something or just fighting for a chance to be viewed as an equal. So I have to work, or
Mm,
at least again, the immigrant mentality and the tautology is you have to work twice as hard to be given the same opportunities. So it's hard to find
mhm,
time for rest when you should be working twice as hard. A 20-hour week means a 40-hour week for me. So it really depends. The other thing is that rest is oftentimes reserved for those who are of old age or very young
mm,
um, and those who have already been productive. So young people are especially are not afforded the same ability to rest. There's always something more that you could be achieving, some level of productivity. Um, yeah, and then I've mentioned these. It's like having our practices sort of taken and resold to us in a commodified version. So when you have that happen, it's hard to engage in those activities, especially in a broader community setting where it's not given the same value or not practiced maybe in a similar way that gives it its true meaning.
absolutely. No, those are all really, really good points. I can even think back to this past weekend. We had a bunch of cousins over, as we do, big family. And my young cousin, she had come back in from vacation, 4 o'clock in the morning. It's now late at night, and she was sleeping. She's maybe 12. And many of the adults said, "Why is she sleeping? I'm old. I get to rest. She's young. She doesn't get to be tired." Well, she's
Mhm.
sleepy. She's like, to me, she's a little baby, but it is this generational idea of, you'll sleep when you're dead, you'll rest when you're older. So it's so ingrained in us, we don't even realize. So with all of these systems, how do you personally navigate rest within institutions, within work, school, or family life?
So I think one thing that I think is really important to mention is the difference it makes having a diagnosis versus not having a diagnosis. So as someone who navigated a lot of this without a diagnosis, it was terrible because of the way that a lot of institutions are set up. They're set up so that you always need to be providing proof or advocating. I have this condition. This is what this
Mhm,
requires. And especially for conditions that are either niche or not, or for even like invisible diseases or illnesses, there is a lot more expectation around advocacy for yourself, which is what it boils down to at the end of the day. So some of the things that I think have been important for myself is expectations. I would love to work a full-time job, or at least I would
mhm,
have liked to when I was having paid episodes, but it wasn't realistic. So I did speak with an employer of mine at the time where I let her know that I want to work. However, I do have this condition, so having work that's more part-time is a little bit more feasible,
mhm,
as well as sort of having knowledge of who I can call if I need someone to cover my shifts. I know it's lost me an opportunity or two because I understand that there is a level of reliability that companies do like from their employees.
mhm,
But that was not for me to jeopardize my health and have the added stress of meeting the expectation of like 30 hours a week when all I could handle was closer to 20. So
mhm,
meeting those expectations is just best for you to not overstretch yourself because for the hours that you are expected to commit and be sort of at 100%, you are jeopardizing that time, as well as just your rest time as well. Because you're worried about work that you haven't completed, or it's like, okay, I'm having a pain episode and I have to go in another 2 hours. How is this going to work? Also, just limits. If you're in school and you can only handle 3 courses, don't just do 3. Pushing yourself is not sustainable long term, and that's one of the biggest things with rest is you're looking for long term sustainability, not trying to burn yourself out. Because already with the disabled body, sometimes you do have more limitations, and pushing yourselves beyond that is not worth it. So I love TikTok in the sense that I love the analogy of spoons. Um, if I only have 8 spoons today, I will only give 8. And some of them might be allocated more so towards just self-care, personal care. Like I need to get up, I need to do dishes, I need to shower, make sure that like I'm ready for the day. That might take up 4 today, but then the other 4 might be allocated towards my courses. And in reality, I can only put in 3. If I am putting in more than the 8 spoons I have today, well, chances are tomorrow is not going to be quite good. So I think having those limits, just to not push yourself long term, and it's not to say I haven't, I 100% have, just because when you're not able to set your own schedule sometimes, especially in institutions where more often than not you sort of have these 2 week periods of just constant onslaught of like exams, midterms, assignments. So in that case, I would seek accommodations. Speaking with people within your institution, either student success, HR, who might be able to accommodate your health needs, whether that's maybe less attendance, getting someone to take notes for you, maybe working from home. It really depends on what your individual needs are. Do let them know what they are. And also, it might be good to work with a doctor who's maybe able to see that your health is deteriorated. Maybe there's no specific diagnosis, but these are the recommendations they give. So there's a little bit more tangibility out there because, again, a lot of institutions are required to have documentation. So at the end of the day, speaking with people allows you to get more, also a lot more understanding and helps you connect with people who you don't realize do care for you and will help you in return. And that will bring me to my last point of community. So a lot of the philosophy of hard work is centered on such an individualistic perspective where it's like I have to do everything, but there's a lot of other help around you without realizing that they could help you. So do speak to people around you. I was very fortunate that I lived in a household where other people around me did have sort of some illness. So there was a lot of understanding around, okay, I can't do this today. I will take care of it tomorrow. And that mutual understanding that I'm not trying to skirt away from my responsibilities. It's just today, these are what I can prioritize and do. The rest I can take care of tomorrow, hopefully. Health granted. So these are the things I would say, and I know they're very general. These were the things that helped me, and they were successful at sometimes, unsuccessful at others, and unfortunately, that is the reality and nature of navigating when you don't necessarily have a very decisive diagnosis, or at least physically visible symptoms. Um, so do what you can, and do know that there are other organizations around who may be able to help you as well, in terms of knowing what you can ask or even devising some creative solutions for you in terms of scheduling. So I'm a firm believer of ask and you shall receive help.
I love that. And there's 2 points I really want to highlight is when you had mentioned spoons of, if I go over spoons today, that impacts tomorrow, because I think sometimes we almost do this thing of, okay, I tried to do 100 things today and I couldn't. So if I do 50 today, now tomorrow's 150 things. It's constantly stacking the next day. And then why am I burnt out? Well, you can't do
Exactly.
3,000 things in one day. And the second point you had mentioned of community, this was actually a question I was going to ask you, but as it's community radio and we're talking about community, who makes up your community? Or yeah, who is your community support? Where were you able to find that?
So community support for me, for starters, was actually my employer.
Mm,
I was very fortunate that I sat down and had a frank conversation with her about 1 or 2 months in, about what my limitations were beginning to be as I started to notice the degradation of my health. Because again, like illness is very dynamic, it's going to change. How I
mm-hmm,
started a position versus how I ended is going to be vastly different. And that's how it was. I started a position really well last summer, and ended up having to leave because of an emergency surgery. So it's quite a dynamic, but I was very fortunate that they were understanding and they didn't require, documentation. To be fair, I worked at a
Mm,
hospital. So this is not their first rodeo. Um, the other community, which I think was really helpful, was going to a professor. It was
mm,
really hard for me to approach a professor, but I went to her sort of seeking out just some ideas on what she could do to help me in terms of flexibility of certain assignments. I didn't end up needing the accommodations, but knowing that they were there was a peace of mind for me that I had some flexibility with a few due dates because oftentimes than not, my condition flared with stress because it was an
mm,
episodic illness. So that helped. The community that I would say was the most supporting was having friends who themselves did have some sort of health ailments.
mm,
There was a mutual understanding that I can't do the dishes today. That's fine. I'll take care of them. So one of my friends would take care of them. And then I would take care of them for her when she was not doing good. So
mm,
just this mutual understanding that I understand what my responsibilities are and I'm taking ownership for them. Do you know that this is something that I deeply care about and I want to make sure that I am meeting your expectations and contributing my share, right? But know that if I can't do it today, it's not from a lack of not wanting to do it. It's just because I can't do it today. So that was
mm,
my community. Um, I can't say family was a big part, and part of that just comes from the fact that I often found myself sort of downplaying what was going on.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and also, it's just my family's relationship with poor health is very complicated,
mm,
where sometimes the assumption was that I had eaten something to cause this, or like a self
mm,
choice was the reason why. But again, there was no real cause for this that anyone could pinpoint. Um, but I would say that during the time of my surgery, my family was sort of my rock and making sure everything was okay. So that they're also part of my community. But I think the relationship with them was hard because more often than not, the conversations when I would give them a call, be like, "How's your health?" So that's also something with time that I learned to communicate with them is like, I would love for our conversations to not center around this. I want you to ask me other
mm,
things because this is already a tough enough thing for me to deal with. I
mm,
don't enjoy speaking about it because it's such a recurrent theme in my life. And they were understanding, they were good in helping sort of move the conversation away. So those I would say would be my community. It was hard to build community, especially when you are disabled, because you don't have the same functionality of going out and meeting new people, right? But
yeah,
in that moment, I was very satisfied with my inner circle because they were very caring and understanding that today is not a good day and that's okay. Tomorrow might be a little bit better, tomorrow might not be better. We'll sort of take it day by day and see how things are going. So, yeah, that's my community.
no, thank you for sharing. And one of the things I want to highlight as I ask this question to, each of our guests is that we often think of friends and family as our core community, but it was so helpful for you to explain, a professor, for an employer, where we don't traditionally think of community as we're trying to expand our idea outside of our immediate circle. So thank you so much for sharing that. Um, I'm curious what advice you'd have for the young Indigenous, Black, and racialized people with disabilities listening that are navigating their identities and seeking to make their voices heard.
A terrible, and I hate this, but it is a necessary part of everything we do, advocacy.
Mhm,
It is a skill that I'm still struggling with and have gotten better at, but not 100%. So one thing that I found was really helpful was take a piece of paper when you are heading to a doctor's appointment where you might be seeking a second opinion or accommodation. Make sure you've written down everything,
mm,
what you're feeling emotionally, what you're feeling physically, socially, what impacts it's having on you. Reason being is when I would converse with doctors, I noticed initially I was very dismissive of my personal things because it's like, I'm ready
mm,
to leave, I need to get out of here. But when you have that paper in front of you, you're like, okay, I forgot to mention this, this, and this. And
mm,
oftentimes doctors are rushing you out, but one of the things that I really try to tell them is, look, I'm not trying to waste your time. I've been to doctor after doctor. I really am looking for some sort of tangible answer and some sort of help. So do you mind waiting until I finish my checklist? And I did get through a good chunk of my checklist. And then once I felt like everything was set, then I would leave. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing also is if you are seeking out second opinions, try to do your research if possible and seeking out
Mm,
maybe a professional who's had experience in your realm. So in my case, I ideally
mm,
should have been to a gastroenterologist, which didn't end up happening due to the long wait times. That's another story.
mm,
But as I mentioned, the doctor who gave me my diagnosis essentially was someone who herself had some sort of different ability. So
mm,
having that empathy and understanding that this person's not coming to you because they enjoy it. They're coming to you because this is a last ditch attempt at finding some answer or just some better understanding of what's going on with their body. Um, because again, like I've had female doctors who've completely dismissed me, but it took this one female doctor with a disability to really have that one extra added layer who took the time to understand me, even if it took her a little bit longer to see other patients. She was basically the one who gave me the diagnosis, which I'm ever grateful for.
mm,
Um, the other thing that I would also recommend is journaling. And I'm not
mm,
talking about daily journaling. That's very task like time consuming. I can't do it. I can't commit to it. However, because I found that my mind would go to rather unsavory places, especially on
mm,
day 4 of being awake, having, very fragmented sleep, not being able to sleep or eat. I wasn't mentally doing well. So I would write down sort of any negative thoughts. And oftentimes when you wrote them down, it was harder to do that. And then when I was doing a little bit
mm,
better, I would reread them and be like, okay, that's incorrect. Not true. Mm-mm. So that way you're also keeping up with not sort of feeding into a lot of the negative thoughts about yourself and limitations when in
mm,
reality, okay, when you are at a healthier point and you do have a little bit more of a positive and kind of a kinder, um, I guess, kinder feelings towards yourself,
yes.
it feels better to read that and be like, okay, you're just being delusional. What is all this garbage? To the trash.
Mm,
Um, it's also important journaling wise is because sometimes I would notice odd symptoms, which I would also help when it came time to bring
mm,
them up to doctors. And then it also helped with sort of tracking health patterns as well. I found is
mm,
sometimes like, okay, this is odd. This used to be, a few hours now. We're at 4 days. That's a bit of an escalation. The other thing is find meaningful engagement. Um, I loved reading and music, which was a very big, I would say, lifesaver during sort of these episodic moments where, especially late in the evening, well, early in the morning, like 3 a.m., where no one's awake. And
mm,
even if someone is stayed up with you, I know they've got work and other things. So during the time that you are alone, something that helps you feel a little bit more alive. um, in the times where I was feeling a little bit better, I would volunteer because that's something that I find very helpful and meaningful for me to do. I felt it feels nice giving back, and oftentimes because I am within the health field, like it's you see a lot of other people with disabilities. So I worked with I volunteer with patients with Alzheimer's, so
mm,
it was nice to spend time with them. So the one of the other things is also research. Keeping detailed records of
mm,
everything is so important, especially for the continuity of care and um, just looking at um, getting your concerns heard because
mm.
in my case I've had the same test performed pretty much every year that I went to a doctor, and every year without fail it was negative, and I was like, look, I've told you it's negative, just listen. So it
Yeah.
saves you a lot of that duplicate testing, which at the end of the day saves you the anguish of going through another test.
Mhm,
And most of all, I would say kindness. It's still a practice
mm,
that is still very hard for me, but kindness to yourself, because your illness is going to be ever changing. There will be some days where you're able to do things and others where rest is the most productive and essential part of your sustainable living or sustainable approach to life. And that is still something that is tough till today, but with time you
mm,
become more willing that and understanding that rest is basically the way that you'll continue living life to the fullest capacity that you can.
mm. Thank you. And, just in mentioning music and kindness, Sometimes when we talk about those things, our tendency is to want to roll our eyes like, yeah, practicing gratitude or giving back to the community, music will help. But, there's actually so much research to support what you're saying of listening to music, the messaging, we really do internalize that. So be mindful of what music we're listening to and how we feel with that music, and practicing kindness to ourselves and gratitude, giving back to the community has so many health benefits, despite our want to, roll our eyes. That's not real, but it really does help for how we feel about ourselves. So thank you so much. So
Absolutely.
looking at how we have today's society and how we view Indigenous, Black, racialized people with disabilities,
Mhm.
what are your hopes for the future in terms of how society views us and treats us at that intersection?
Uh, First and foremost, do know that our environment is a large contributor to a lot of our ill health.
Mm,
Health is not solely based on just lifestyle. Our environment is a big determinant, and more often than not, we're not given the same environment, we're not given the same chances. So do know that because you're seeing a number of us ill, well, our environment is not conducive to healthy living. The
mm,
other thing to also note, and this is just more a general thing, is illness is valid without diagnosis, because a
mm,
diagnosis is not otherwise obvious. Um, and this is often the case for like individuals like myself, where it's like you've spent 5 years searching for an
mm,
answer. It's not for a lack of trying; it's because the same things were not afforded. For example, I have a friend who within a year was given her diagnosis. Mind you, was her thing a little bit more straightforward? Potentially, no one knows.
mm,
But 1 year versus 5 years and the impact that has on your quality of life is very different. Um,
mhm,
Also, accommodations go beyond written expectations by the AODA, if I'm not mistaken. Like
mhm,
breaks and flexible scheduling is great, but I think long term, I would love to have insurance cover more services and for part time work to also be included in getting an insurance coverage. Because if that's what your full
mm,
capability is, then that's what should be covered. Um, Also, disability is not an age based thing. As someone whose symptoms started as a very young age, and this was sort of the
mhm.
biggest reason for dismissal, in addition to being a young Indian woman, I was not pleased.
Yeah.
And one of the main things was just when I'm when I have explicitly expressed that medication is not what I'm seeking out,
Mm,
that should not be your answer to slap on medication and hope and pray it works.
mhm,
Um, the other thing is an all or nothing approach. Illness does not mean that you're going to sit at home all day. Illness still means you have the capacity, today to go outside and engage with people. Maybe tomorrow you require a little bit more indoor rest. That's fine. But you can't have an all or nothing approach. Like people who are ill or disabled do have the ability and should be taking space within a society because, again, the environment is disabling, not the disability.
mm,
Um, and then I would also say, do taking to mind, and I think Emma says this phenomenal, that the mind, the body, and the environment are not separate. You should be taking
mm,
more of histories into account, the environment that people grew up in, and that might give you a lot more insight into what and why they are ill,
mm,
and sort of what the causative agent behind all of this could have been. So, medicalization of the body is great, but beyond the biological sort of approach that you're taking, you're not really doing much to look at life as a whole, which it is. It's not just health or a lack thereof.
yes, that's such a good way to summarize everything. Thank you. Um, I wanted to ask if there was anything we wanted to go back and talk about, but I know you had mentioned the 7 kinds of rest, and we're going to get into them. So I was wondering if you wanted to explain a bit more about that and, yeah, what each type is.
Yeah, for sure. So the ending note, which I'm hoping to give you a little bit more tangible strategies on
Mhm,
what rest is, because I'm sure you've heard enough about me. But I wanted to talk about rest and why it's so important in terms of the different ways that you can practice it. Like, don't get me wrong, I love sleep as much as the next person. It's
mm,
great. But sleep is not the only way I think rest can nourish you. So physical rest, like sleep, is great foundation. And if just know that if that requires the addition of a certain aid, such as medication, that's okay.
mm,
That was one of the harder lessons that I learned during hospital. With all the beeps and the constant commotion of the nurses going around, it was necessary. Did I enjoy it? No, but it's what got me rest during a time where I was particularly physically weak and it was necessary. Exercise is great. I find after a long day of work, when it might be rather hard to turn my brain off, a little bit of exercise can do wonders, especially if that maybe is just some yoga to wind down your day after something that has been mentally taxing, which we can move on to mental rest. So, during a pain episode, I find myself doing this very much so. I'll be thinking about all the things I need to do to be productive, all the limitations, but oftentimes this will take you into a scarcity mindset and stress you out more because the stress is very pervasive. So I would say give your time to rest and turn that brain off. So sometimes during these moments, I would just write down a list of tasks and put it on the side. I don't have to think about it. Or anything that comes to mind, write it down, go somewhere else. Anything that will occupy myself. So mental rest also sometimes would just mean reading. So my brain is occupied with something that is a little bit more fun. A good fiction book is always great. So sensory rest. I love doom scrolling after work. It is great to turn my brain off, but really your brain's not turned off. Um, Oftentimes it's still running, but you've sort of just silenced it. So sensory rest is also just silence and quiet. I love music or a show when I'm doing something, but that's not always giving you the chance to actually fully engage in what you're doing. Just having a quiet moment. So sometimes sensory rest might mean a little bit of meditation for me that's guided because I find it very hard to quiet my mind. So having that guiding voice is very, very helpful. So the next one I would say would be creative rest. So meaningful engagement is a very essential part of living. For me, reading and listening was very important. Listening to music was very important. But creative rest can really be just about anything. If that means you're going to go out into the nature, so be it, if that's what you need. But something that helps you express your creative side, whether that's arts and crafts, whether that's baking, which is a really important thing for me, in part because I have a sweet tooth. But also it's a nice way to also build community. It was always nice to share, a cup of tea and a muffin with some friends. So there's also emotional rest. So this is especially important during long nights where I couldn't sleep and I would agonize over every little detail of my ill health. I found just self-compassion was good. Just something that, okay, my body can't do this today. That's okay, but it did do this, this, and this. And then just writing down anything that I might be feeling during that moment and realizing that in that moment where you are feeling particularly vulnerable and you aren't happy with the way things are, it's a natural thing. So let yourself feel that and then know that that was at a moment where you really were not doing well, and that's okay. But in reality, you don't have these same beliefs about yourself and in your limitations. There was also social rest. So I found myself in pain more times than not, and that was often in solitude. So when I could, I would try to seek out quality interactions with people who would nourish my soul when it was permissible. Some days it's not. And I think social rest was a big thing because there have been several times where I've had opportunities and I've had to cancel because I physically just wasn't able to. And I found focusing on the quality of interaction. So, as much as I love a good party as the next person, I found just sitting with friends, chatting was definitely a lot better for me, or going out for a coffee date was a lot easier for me than something that was a little bit more physically taxing. And then the last would just be spiritual rest. That's looking at altruism and volunteering. If you find that religion is something that you identify with, by all means, if that is what's going to give you that community, by all means. It wasn't something that I found myself gravitating towards, but I did find myself gravitating towards volunteering because that's what I enjoyed. So these are the 7 different types of rest. And 3, 4, 5. Yeah, we're good. 7. And any combination of these might help you. So, and do know that there's so many different ways of engaging in them. It doesn't have to be like, okay, I've done creative rest today, I've done emotional rest. No, no, no. Find what helps you rest. Some days for me, it's physical exercise and creative rest. Other days, I just need some social rest, and that is phenomenal. That is the remedy. Or some days, I just need to go out and touch grass. I don't know.
Always love that
Reconnect with
expression.
nature.
No, thank you. It's so important, like you said, to find that combo that works well for you. And I think for a lot of these, I have no idea what the research is that backs this, but your thoughts at night are always a little bit harsher than they are during the daytime.
For sure.
Midnight, 1 a.m., that's when we start getting some maybe not as great thoughts about ourselves, about the world, how we fit in. So that's so important to apply to all of these. And like you said, finding your spot, I can't remember which one it was where you said make a list. I find for myself, I will go on Temu, a site I never shop from. I fill my cart like I'm redecorating my room, and then I delete the whole cart the next day. It's just about doing something to feel like, oh, great, my brain was occupied. Check, check, check. There's the
Hmm.
dopamine. Let's do something else. So it really is whichever fits. I wanted to kind of move into, as we wrap up, our shameless plug corner of if people wanted to connect with you, if that's something you're comfortable with, where is somewhere that you would like them to come find you, or if they wanted to kind of chit chat more, yeah, how would they do that?
Uh, good question. I think the only public social thing I have right now is LinkedIn.
I love LinkedIn. I know it's a nerd platform, but I like it.
It's an interesting platform. Some days good, some days bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm always open to hearing about your experiences. In part because I think I hold a very weird and odd experience where I no longer have pain episodes, but there's still
Mm,
remnants of, not having a functioning organ. So that's always kind of fun.
mm.
Um, yeah, no, by all means, if you would like to connect with me, you can search Tulsi Pandya into the LinkedIn and I should hopefully pop up. I think my profile is public. If it's not, I will make it public. But yeah, I'm always happy to chat and sort of get to know new people and sort of what their experiences have been, as I'm sure we can all bond over some rather unsavory encounters.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And just as a final, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I totally skipped over, or if you had any final closing thoughts?
No, just sort of that. So we've covered basically everything, but I would like to mention that I by no means am good at rest.
Mm,
It's something that I've had to force myself actively to do over time. And there's some days where I'll still fall into the pitfall of doom scrolling,
mhm,
or hermiting, when in reality I should be going out and chatting a little bit more with people, even if it's with like the same two people. Um, so do know that with sort of the changing dynamic of illness, so is your definition and so is the way that you'll rest. But
mm,
do you find some way in each day and every day that you can integrate rest in? Because long term, that's how you're not going to burn yourself out.
mm.
Um, and also just find something fun about your day.
I love that. Those are some beautiful closing words. Thank you so much for being with us here on Community Radio. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm sure we'll have another wonderful episode for you coming up. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.